Okay, so today we're going to talk about segmentation, targeting, and positioning. Now, let me start with segmentation. Let's go through what it is, and then let's get into why segmentation is actually important and why we do it. So, what is a segment? A segment is basically a group of customers or organizations, if you're talking about business to business marketing, that are quite similar among them. Okay, so they are similar in the way they buy things, they're similar in their preferences, they're similar in what they want or expect from a company or a product. Okay, so we call that a segment. We're going to talk about how the segments are created, or better said, identified in a minute. Okay, other than what a segment is, what segmentation is the process of identifying the segments, right? And making sure that those segments are actually meaningfully different from each other, right? So we want to make sure that everybody within the segment is as homogeneous or similar as possible. And anybody across segments, if we have, let's say, 2 or 3 segments, that they are indeed quite different, okay? So that we can actually use different strategies for each of those segments. Strategies could be different products, different commercials, different ways of getting the product to the customer, etc. Okay? And we're going to call a target to the segment or segments that we identified as most viable and best strategic fit for us. And because of that, those are the ones that we're going to try to interact with for the most part. Okay? So the question is, why are we going to do segmentation at all? Why not just do something else? Now, let me try to address that issue, right? In principle, all customers are unique. And because all customers are unique, we would like to treat each customer uniquely, right? We would like to address their preferences uniquely by designing unique products or services for that customer. We will also like to do that with the way we communicate with the customer, right? So we would like to create messaging that is unique to that customer, etc., etc. Now, what is the downside of this uniqueness is that for the most part, because of our technological limitations, it is not actually feasible to produce unique products for each customer, right? Even though that will be probably an ideal scenario. So what do we do? In the old days, if you go back 100 years, what we will do is we will treat everybody the same. So we'll create a product for the mass market. The classic example of this was well captured by something that Henry Ford said when asked about the color options for the Model T Ford. He said something like this: you could have any color so long as it was black, right? So basically pointing out that there was only one option for everybody. And this is what we do with a lot of things, right? When you go to a car dealership, there are a few options that you can add to the car, but the actual car structure, right, and for the most part is the same. The engine is usually the same. You might have 1 or 2 engines within that line of cars. The same thing with your transmission, right? So there are limited amount of options because building unique cars for every customer is just too expensive. In fact, this is the way cars were built 100 years ago. They were custom-made projects that were basically built to the specifications of a customer. And they were so expensive that almost nobody could afford them, right? So because of this affordability, what we do is we try to get in between. Instead of treating everybody the same or treating everybody uniquely, what we try to do is we try to identify these things called segments, right? Segments which are basically a reflection of the fact that people are different, but we group them such that they are, a sizable enough group of customers that have similar enough preferences that are gonna enable us to design maybe a product for that segment instead of for each unique customer within the segment. So segmentation is essentially and targeting. Segmentation and targeting are a reaction to this uniqueness and an accommodation of what we can do for the most part, given the constraints that we will have to work with in terms of technology and cost. Now, what do we use to segment markets? There are different types of variables that we can actually use to identify this unique group of customers that are similar within within the group of customers, so unique segments. The most widely used variable for segmentation is demographic segmentation. And what does demographic segmentation mean? It means using characteristics of the individual such as gender, age, or income. Okay. Oftentimes these variables are widely available. So the nice thing about demographic segmentation is that it's actually relatively easy to get the information to do that and be able to create segments. And the downside is that people that have the same age, gender, and income. So if you have two males and they are both age 25 and they both have an income of, let's say, $40,000 a year, they are going to exhibit very different behaviors. So even though they have the same demographics, people are going to have different preferences and different behaviors. So the demographic segmentation is easy, and because of that, many companies actually use it. But the downside is that it doesn't strongly correlate with behavior and preferences, which is what we are interested in, right? We don't care about, gender, income, or anything else. What we really care about is what people want, desire, and are interested in, right? Another type of variable that it's used also very commonly is geographic segmentation, right? Geographic segmentation. So that just, means where you are located. And obviously this is going to have an impact in what you buy, right? Because different locations are going to have, for example, different weather or available activities. So if you live by the beach, for example, you're going to be more likely interested in going into the water and maybe doing some water sports, etc. So that's going to help. Also, you can use geographic information to guess other information. So this is done with zip code based segmentation. Oftentimes you will go to a store, and when you are going to check out, the person that is checking you out will say, hey, could you give me what your zip code is? What they're trying to do is they're trying to guess a lot about you by just using the information about where you live, right? And in fact, not even where you live, the street, but actually the zip code. You can actually guess things like who you're going to vote for, and what your average income is, and what your age is going to be, pretty reasonably if you just tell me the zip code. Okay. So there is information in there, and as such, we can use it for segmentation. Highly available. It has the same downsides as demographic segmentation. In fact, they are very similar. Okay. Then the next level over is psychographic segmentation. This is where we look at the interest that people have, and we try to map those and their attitudes and values, and try to map those so that we can actually understand what they are interested in doing, and hence what kind of products and services are they going to be leaning towards, right? So this is looking at things like media consumption, the kind of activities that you do for leisure, what are you interested in, right? That will be psychographic segmentation. A classic example of psychographic segmentation that is used widely is called lifestyle segmentation. We'll talk some more about that when I describe the strategy for Volvo and for the car manufacturer Volvo. Okay. And finally, we have behavioral segmentation. Now, the downside of psychographic segmentation is that getting that data is non-trivial. So you need to have customers answer long questionnaires. It takes a long time. It's cognitively taxing. You usually have to pay people to do it. Otherwise, you get very little useful information because they just fly through the questions without really paying too much attention to them. Behavioral segmentation is looking at what people actually do. So at the end of the day, to some degree, this is almost the ultimate type of segmentation that you're going to encounter. And the reason why is because it's not about what, their characteristics, it's not about where they live, it's not about what they're interested in, it's about what they actually do. So in that sense, this is very useful. The downside in the past was that we didn't have really a lot of behavioral information, right? So you could have some behavioral information if you had an internal database when you record the purchases of your customers, so you will know from existing customers what they bought from you. But you don't see a lot of things, right? You don't see whether they buy from other competitors, right? And getting that data might actually be tricky. You might have to hire a company like Nielsen to give you information about that from the panelists, right? They have a panel of customers. But nowadays things are starting to change, and this is mostly enabled by technology. So you have a cell phone that you carry with you pretty much all day to all places, and because of that, the companies now have access to information about A, your location, okay, and B, they also know what they are doing. They know if you're going to certain stores or establishments. They also know what kind of products you're buying, at least online, or checking out, even if you don't buy. This is why there are commercials that follow you from your laptop to your smartphone, and within a few minutes of checking a product in one, you have a commercial for the same thing in the other, right? So behavioral segmentation has really opened up hugely because of technology, because of all the app and real-time data that we have access to right now, with all the online shopping and in general usage of digital media, right? So now behavioral segmentation has become a huge part. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of the apps will actually allow you to access their services for free, because they are going to sell this information, this behavioral information, to other companies that they use to sell your products. Okay. Now, when I'm talking about segmentation, that is more the quantitative aspect that is behind this. But there is a type of a study that it's usually done after the segmentation is completed, which is called persona research. And the idea is basically you're going to come up with segments that are going to give you information about the characteristics of the people that are within the segment. So you'll know ages, and you'll know like a gender breakdown, and you will know what their income is. Maybe you're doing lifestyle segmentation, you might know a little bit about their interest. What persona research is trying to do is trying to provide a more qualitative feel for this group, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a story. In fact, you're trying to build an archetype, like some sort of ideal customer that represents the entire group that we can actually relate to, right? This will help when you're doing communication. So when you're building an ad, right? If you really understand who the person is that you're building the ad for, it will be easier, right? Or creating maybe better than building. And the same thing with the product, right? When you're trying to design a product, if you really have a good feel for the person that you're designing the product for, it's going to be easier, right? So if you're a product designer, you need to be able to relate to the pain points that these people actually have and how you're going to solve them. So here you have, a brief story about who Caitlin is, right? And, where she lives and what she does, how many kids she has, and why she's interested in maybe buying a product that you could be designing for. So persona research is a very, very important aspect that happens after the segmentation to enable that information from segmentation to be used by multiple parts of the organization, from the communication aspect all the way to the design of the product. Now, once that we have identified our segments, what we're going to do is we're going to try to target some of those segments. What does targeting mean? Well, targeting is the idea of basically selecting either a subgroup or one of the segments that we have identified through our segmentation study. And it depends on the kind of strategy that you're going to use, right? So we have those strategies here. You can use an undifferentiated marketing strategy, which essentially means ignoring the segmentation altogether and treating everybody the same, right? If this is what you're going to do from the beginning, you shouldn't do a segmentation study, which is expensive, because actually you're not going to use it, right? But having said that, other than the undifferentiated strategy, you could be doing a differentiated strategy, which means essentially you're taking those segments and doing something with them. What do you do with them? The important part is that your strategy varies across the segments. So targeting will be to pick one or several of those segments and try to basically capture customers in that segment. Okay. Niche marketing or concentrated marketing, it means when you select a smaller segment that you don't think your competitors are going to be targeting. Okay, because maybe small, or maybe it's less appealing because it's harder to satisfy these customers, right? And then, the other extreme to this will be micro marketing, which is the idea of, one-to-one marketing, when you just create a unique strategy. So that means a unique product, a unique price, and all the piece, right, for each of the customers, right? So here we have the spectrum that I was discussing before, from treating everybody the same to treating people uniquely, right? And technologies enable us to move in this direction. So for example, if you go to M&M's, right, website, you can actually have M&M's print, for example, the name of your significant other in each of the M&M's in a bag, and they'll charge you quite a bit of money for it, for being an M&M bag, let's say $5 or $10, right? Versus you can buy the same bag for $1 at the store. But it's a way of customizing, making the product unique to you, right? And if you're thinking around St. Valentine's Day, you don't know what to buy for your girlfriend, this is potentially an interesting product that otherwise you probably will never have considered, right? And it's just interesting because it's uniquely targeted or built for you. So there is a wide range of possibilities, and the question is, what are you going to do with information from segmentation, right? Now, how do you decide on what segments to target? Well, it's going to boil down to a trade-off between what is appealing to you essentially as a company, right? And I'm going to talk about some of those aspects. And also how attractive this segment is going to be for others. Because of course, if you go for the most attractive segment, what's going to happen is competitors are also going to be present in there, and it's probably going to be harder to acquire any of the customers in this space. So it's going to be a trade-off between these two. Now, what should you consider in terms of attractiveness if you look at the characteristics of the segment? Well, the obvious one would be size, right? So bigger segments are everything else holding constant more interesting, right? Because they will enable to have basically more customers, right? But size, it could be measured in number of people. It could also be measured in their purchasing power. So size could be large, even on the group small, if that people have a lot of income that is disposable. So if you are looking at, I don't know, very expensive luxury items, right, like very expensive watches. If you're targeting a group of people that have really high income, even though their number might be small, right? So if you define size in terms of the number of people in the segment, if you design size as their amount of disposable income, then that group of people that was small beforehand now becomes a lot bigger. So it really depends on your definition. Another aspects that are obviously attractive is how fast is that segment growing, and how sensitive they are to pricing, meaning, how much margin can you charge to your products. Some customers are more price sensitive. Those will react strongly to changes in your price, and not having that will actually be helpful for your profitability. So you want to have more margin potential if you can. Okay. And then on the internal aspects, what will make for an attractive segment will be one that we can actually serve well. So it's essentially about the fit between the organization and what the customer in that segment wants, or the kind of benefits that they are interested in. So what are we going to look at? Are we going to look at, do we have the capabilities to serve this customer appropriately? Do we have the right channel partners that are going to enable us to actually provide the value that this customer, that is the typical customer in this segment, is going to be demanding, right? So it's about how attractive the segment is, but also it's about how well can we serve that segment or create unique value for that segment. And obviously, the ideal scenario for us is to have a segment that is attractive and for which we can do a good job at serving. So we have a strong fit with, right? This is how you select essentially between different types of segments. You will go through this analysis and pick the ones that, you know, serve in this quadrant, the ones that are the best in terms of attractiveness and fit. Now, what are we going to do once that we identified which segments are we going to be targeting? Well, there are different things that we can do, but essentially it comes down to modifying or uniquely fitting your 4 Ps, your 4 marketing Ps to each of these segments. So you could change the product, okay? Sometimes changing the whole product is actually hard. So what you might have to do is you might have to have adaptations of the product that maybe do not adapt the actual core of the product. So if you have a car, and this is one thing that a lot of car manufacturers do, you might have a platform that underpins the car, and that platform is shared across multiple product iterations. So for example, Audi and Volkswagen, they have shared platforms that they use for cars. So if you're buying an Audi A5 or an Audi A4 or an Audi A6, they all share the same platform, but the cars are different, right? Their sizes are different, their customer segment that they're trying to target is different. And the way they achieve this is by trying to maintain the core of the product by modifying the periphery of the product, by trying to, you know, use platforms. It's, you know, the technologically feasible and slightly economically more feasible approach to modifying the product, okay? And that will be customizing the product without modifying the core, right? Changing the core is usually too expensive to do, but it can be done in some cases as long as the new segment that you're trying to target is large enough that will, and it will enable you to do that economically, right? Sometimes you don't change the product at all. All you will do is you will provide a different degree of service for essentially the same product. Banks tend to do this, right? So they will have the same infrastructure for all your customers, but if you are, for example, a high income person that is doing, you know, they have maybe a wide portfolio of banking needs because they have investments, maybe you have a small business that you're running also out of the same bank, the level of service that you're going to receive from the bank is different, even though the infrastructure and the core products that are offered to you or somebody like me who maybe just has only a checking account with the bank is going to be essentially the same. Okay, so what you're doing is you're modifying the level of service or services that are actually offered, even though the actual core product is essentially the same. You can also change the channels, so you might be able to offer different channels for different types of customers. So some people might prefer shopping online versus going to a brick and mortar store. You could also adapt the pricing. This is clearly done by airlines, for example, and many companies, not only airlines. By, for example, charging different prices depending on when you buy the tickets. If you buy them far in advance, there's a good chance that you are basically somebody who is going to visit somebody for an event that it's probably of personal nature. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is, because usually a lot of the business trips are not are hard to plan 3 or 4 months in advance. So what you can do is you can use this way of segmenting customers, right, by pricing differently depending on what type of customer do you have, right? What else can you do? You can change anything that is part of your strategy, marketing strategy, to basically improve the chances that the segment that you're trying to target is going to buy your product. Now, once that you have identified your segments, and after identifying the segments, decide on which segment or segments to target, what you need to do is you need to define your positioning. Now, what is positioning? Positioning is how you're trying the customer to perceive your product and your brand. So positioning and differentiation are like two sides of the same coin. Differentiation is something that you hear about in strategy, not only in marketing, but in strategy in general, which is the idea of making your products be unique in the eyes of the customers. Because if they see them as uniquely beneficial, what's going to happen is they are going to be a lot more likely to buy your products or services, and it's going to make your odds of succeeding in the marketplace a lot higher, right? But notice one thing that it's essential here is that we're talking about positioning, we're talking about something that happens in the minds of the consumers. It's all about perception, right? So when we're talking about positioning, we're talking about how the customer perceives our products. Now, customers are smart, so I'm not saying that, you know, this doesn't need to be backed up by reality, but telling the message about what the brand benefits are, what the product benefits are, in a clear and in a way that the customer actually understands is very, very important. Also notice that positioning is always relative to your competitors. So your customer frame of reference is going to be who your competitors are. So when you're saying that your laptop is light, right? It's light relative to other laptops that are options within this, for example, price bracket, right? So if you're buying a laptop between $500 and $700 that has a screen of 15.4 inches, maybe you will expect your laptop to be about 2.5 to 3 pounds, right? So if that's the range of weights that you find in the marketplace, now launching a laptop that it's sub 2 pounds will actually be something that is unique in a positioning that maybe at least for some time you could maintain as a light laptop, something that is enabling you to carry it around more easily, right? So the customer frame is essentially what is the customer comparing your product or service claims to, right? So when we're talking about positioning, is how they perceive it, and that's going to be shaped by who your competitors actually are. Okay, and also remember that it's all relative, right? When it comes down to this, so it's not an absolute weight. What we're talking about is the weight relative to our competitive alternatives. Okay, and when I say weight, by the way, positioning, you can position yourself into any aspects, right? So let me show you here a quick analysis of positioning within car manufacturers, right? So what you have here is you have an analysis that identifies what are the 6 most important vectors of differentiation. So what I've put here, at least this is within the car market, and there might be a couple others that I forgot, but you know, this is a start, right? You should do some research before you do any positioning to make sure that you include all the vectors that customers consider important when it comes down to their product purchases. So we have here the degree of luxury, we have style, so how the product looks in and out. We have performance, right? Which, you know, we need to talk about what it means, right? We have the degree of affordability or price, money, right? We have safety and we have reliability, right? And this actually describes a lot of industries, not only car manufacturers. You can apply this to other spaces as well, maybe adding a couple more vectors for completeness. So the idea of positioning is that you basically are going to take one of these vectors that customers care for. Remember, these are identified as features of the product or benefits, better benefits than features, that customers truly care for. At least some customers, not every customer is going to care about all of them, but there is going to be sizable groups of customers that care at least about one of these aspects of the product, right? And the idea of positioning is basically becoming the strongest brand in the marketplace or one of the strongest brands in at least one of these attributes. Now, you could try or strive to become the strongest in all of them, but as we will see, a lot of these attributes are actually they go in opposite directions from each other. So for example, here you have performance, right? And here you have luxury. Now, you can try to have a mixture of both, like, you know, a fairly luxurious and high performance vehicle right? So there are a number of brands that try this, like for example, BMW, right? The downside is obviously if you're really striving for performance, luxury, because it includes, a set of materials that tend to be heavier because they feel nicer, but for performance, the lighter the car it is, the better it's going to perform. These two things are going to go, and to some degree, in different directions. So if we really try to push the luxury positioning, performance is going to have to suffer to some degree, right? And the same thing happens with everything else. Okay, there are things that go in opposite directions. You have the same thing, reliability and performance, and style and performance could also, to some degree, one could argue, in different directions. This is one is form, designing the product form over function. The other one is function over form. So some of the high performance cars look ugly, right, because they have all these appendages around the car, versus other cars are more stylish, right? And now I want to talk to you about a specific brand, just so that we can make this more concrete. And so let's talk about Volvo. Volvo is an interesting car company because if you ask people, and especially 10, 15 years ago, if you ask anybody about Volvo, what they will have told you is that Volvo stands for a safe car, right? That was their number one positioning attribute. It was about safety. And, because they were not inexpensive cars, there was some luxury associated with it, but it was not the typical thing that people will tell you luxury, right? So they were more priced as an upscale car, but their main positioning claim was safety, right? So let me show you how this brand has evolved over time. I'm gonna move forward on the slides and then we'll go back a little bit. Okay, so traditionally what has happened with Volvo, right? This is a very typical commercial that Volvo will have run many years. That there are many commercials like this if you search YouTube, right? The image quality, by the way, is all it's not very good because it's an old commercial. So let's see. This is how Volvo was depicted by most messaging. Let's say from the year 2000 backwards. Let's see if this works.
Every year, Volvo subjects its cars to a race of doom, providing us with insight to help make our cars safer for you.
So this will have been typical positioning commercial for or messaging for Volvo, let's say from when the company was started until the early 2000s, right? Now this started to change, and why did it change? Because the environment changed. So what happened is car manufacturers basically got better at designing cars, and Volvo went from being one of the safest cars to becoming essentially a Me Too car because everybody was making safe cars. So engineers, if you give them a standard that they need to meet, right, they get pretty good at it. So what has happened is all car manufacturers have caught up. Instead, in fact, Volvo has tried to change the standards, and it has tried to lobby the US government to change the standards and make them stricter for the crash test. Just, I think, hoping to differentiate themselves because they can probably meet tighter standards. But once that the standard is set, if everybody can meet it, then how can you tell who is a safe car and who is not, right? So most cars now will be between 4 and 5 stars in pretty much every crash test, right? So as this has changed, what has happened with their positioning is it has become a little bit of a non-issue. So they've been moving away from safety into other spaces. So they've considered different applications. Let me just show you how things have moved a little bit over the years. So here you have sex appeal. Now notice this is a very subdued version of sex appeal.
Lost in a daydream of blue, and I feel so free. And then it's like I fall from the sky. Everything that I see is you. Oh, I adore you. The 2008 Volvo S80 luxury sedan.
Also notice that it mentions luxury sedan, right? So these were the two pillars. It was safety and luxury sedan, but there is no reference there to safety at all, right? Then here you have sportiness and emotion, which really doesn't fit into the traditional perspective at all.
Facing the world's toughest competitors with a turbocharged engine and all-wheel drive system built for hairpin turns, hard-fought victories, and milk runs. The Volvo S60, designed around speed, designed around you.
Okay, so now we're moving totally away from the traditional positioning that Volvo has occupied into sportiness and emotion. They tested this for a few years. In fact, 2008, there used to be a commercial on the same of the same theme, but unfortunately, it's down in YouTube right now. So I found this other one. They've gone back to the luxury aspect, which I think it's a running theme through all the commercials. So they haven't given up on this vector of positioning. Let me show you a more current commercial. Okay, so again, reinforcing luxury in a very subdued way. Oops, I think I put it again. Sorry about that. Okay, good. And then I have here an example of how Volvo is actually using lifestyle segmentation in their commercials. So one thing that's happening, I think, with Volvo is they are trying to grasp what the identity of the brand should be. Their traditional positioning has been threatened by the changes, so they are, I think, experimenting with different things. So here you have lifestyle segmentation from Volvo. So let's start with the first one. Okay, so notice a few themes within the commercial. First, it's an American city. Okay. Also notice that it's for a younger couple for the most part, right? But they look like they are dressed in a way that I will consider them to be somewhat successful, even though they are young adults, right? They are early stages of adulthood, right? And hint, no kids in there, right? Also notice it's an SUV, it's an entry-level product within the Volvo lineup in the US, XC40, right? And now we're going to see, in contrast to that, a different commercial that probably it's geared towards a different market, probably Europe. So notice the people depicted in the commercial are different, right? They are later, maybe early middle age, I will say, in their lifestyle, and they already have kids, but they are reasonably young kids still. They also have social life still, right? So it's depicted as people that are doing well. And also notice that the car is not an SUV; it's actually a station wagon, which is a lot more popular in Europe for whatever reason. In the US, we don't like station wagons much, although of course, some people will, but they don't do well overall. So different lifestyle, and here you have even a more stark contrast. Now, interestingly, if you were paying attention to the commercials, there are a couple of things you will notice. First, like I said, this is also for a young adult, but it's a single, or at least it's depicted as single. We really don't know, but it's the part that we are seeing. It could be somebody who is not single, but is referring to only one part of their life. We've talked about roles in class already. But notice it's young. It looks like successful. We don't know why, but because they have an expensive car and they have time to go and enjoy their day, at least sometime, doing what they like, which seems to be going outdoors for a run, right? Also notice this is not an entry level within their line already. It's more like mid level. It's also an SUV, so it's probably for the American market. And also given who the actor is. And the brand is depicted differently, right? But here is the interesting thing. If you're paying attention to the music in this third commercial, it's throw to the luxury commercial that I'll show you with the area. It's the same music. It's just kind of a distorted version of it, more modern and less classic, even though still, classical music. Okay, and here I have the last one for today, which is some of the campaigns that they are using this year.
Do you recall, not long ago, we would walk on the sidewalk, innocent, remember, all we did was care for each other, but the night was warm, we were holding young, all around the windows, we would only hold on to let go.
And notice that in a way we're coming full circle, right? So now they're talking about keeping your kids safe. So we see a mom that looks, I would say, in the mid 40s, maybe even late 40s, right? So it's a little bit later in the life stage, right? Again, it's not the entry level car, so they're trying to push people from the entry level when you're younger to the older car, which makes sense. Sorry, older, more expensive cars as you get older, because probably you'll be doing better financially, right? But also, what is interesting to me is that they are moving now back to safety, but there is kind of a twist. So it's not only safety, but also we're trying to save the planet, right? So we are trying to do that by be responsible with the environment, and the way we're going to do that is electrifying the cars. Now, notice this is not necessarily an electric car; it's just a car that has an electric motor, so it's a hybrid. And in fact, it's a plug-in hybrid, so you can actually plug it and get some capacity where you can actually use the car in electric mode for short distances, right? So we kind of come full circle, and I think they're still tinkering with their positioning. Now, the risk of changing positioning is that people don't know where you stand for, and you can see that this company is moving from one side to another to another. We'll see where it ends up, okay? Now let me go back in the presentation a little bit. Okay, so we were talking about what positioning is. I've already shown you a very detailed example. Now, you have here in the slides something that is useful. If you're trying to set a positioning statement for a brand, and these are the elements you need to hit on. Number one, who are your customers? Okay. What are the needs and benefits that you're trying to fulfill? Okay. So why do I care if I'm a customer, essentially? Okay. And then third, why is this product your best option to actually take care of those needs? Okay. So if you can answer these three things in your positioning statement, you are in good shape. So a positioning statement typically will look like this. Our product is among all comparative frames. So who are you competing against? And okay, let's try that again. Our typical positioning statement will be our product or brand is, and then say what your single most important claim is, or aspect that you're trying to differentiate yourself in among all competitors, because, and then provide some evidence that supports your claim about your positioning statement, right? And here you have the example of Volvo, right? For upscale American families, Volvo is the family automobile that offers maximum safety, right? And here you have an alternate positioning statement. And I've already walked you guys through how Volvo has changed over the years. Now, how do you measure this positioning in the marketplace? If you've been paying attention, one thing that I've mentioned that it's important is that this positioning statement or this positioning effort that we're doing, it's relative to our competitors. So how do we actually know where we are in the minds of the customers, right? How do we know how people perceive their product? So one thing that you can use for that is called a perceptual map. It's basically a tool that visually displays the perception that customers have about products in a set of brands or set of options, okay? And what it does is it just summarizes all the information about your positioning, and it does so visually so you can actually see where you stand. And there are two ways of capturing the data. I'm not going to get into too much technical details on this. It could be attribute-based or similarity-based. But the important thing is what you will do is ahead of time, if you're using attribute-based approaches, which are the most commonly used ones, you will go and gather information about what attributes customers care for, right? I gave you, in the case of the car, we have those 6 vectors that, we have identified: safety, style, luxury. And so those are the kind of attributes that I'm talking about. And then what you're going to do is you're going to gather information about the different brands, right? So you're going to have questions about, each of the brands, about each of the attributes. So there's going to be a lot of questions. And then what you do is you compress all that information. So let me show you how it looks like. And this is for beer, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm putting into a diagram the positioning of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 brands, right? So I have 12 brands of beer, And this is how people perceive them in the marketplace. So you can see there are some beers that are close to each other. There are beers that are far away from each other. Now, whenever you're doing this positioning maps, and the axes that I have drawn in here, they are not per se named. These are basically mathematically computed based on the original questions, right? So you might have 15, 20, 30, 40 questions that are asked. And based on that, what you're doing is you're collapsing those 30 questions, let's say, into two dimensions, two things that capture all the information in all the 30 questions, right? So naming this axis is something that you need to do a posteriori. So let's try to do that. If you know anything about beers, maybe you can see a pattern, maybe you cannot. I'm really not an expert in beers, right? But if you know something about the brands, you might be able to tell that certain beers seem to be together and certain beers are kind of far apart, right? So let's see if we can learn more about this by looking at the questions. Okay, so here you have some of the questions that were used in this particular study. So you have here, one of the questions was, this is the kind of beer that I drink when I'm dining out. And this beer, I consider this beer to be premium. This is a beer for special occasions. And I notice all these three questions that sound pretty similar to me. They are in this dimensional space. They're almost on top of each other. The angle between the vectors that you observe in this two-dimensional space, it's related to each other. If two attributes or two questions are very close to each other, what will happen is they will lay on top of the same plane. And you can see that these three questions that are very similar, they almost lie on top of this, which is the axis. So we're going to use these questions for giving us an idea of what this axis means. So I think, as you move in this direction, the beer is going to be more premium because of these three inclinations we have in here. Okay, sorry, questions, not inclinations. You can also see that polar opposite to it, which is 180 degrees, you have here good value, right? This question will be something like, I think this beer is a good value, or you get a lot for your money when it comes down to buying this beer, right? So as you can see, it almost goes opposite to premium, which makes sense. So this gives you an idea that this diagram actually has some face validity, right? So the questions are pointing in the direction that we will expect. And what correlates with this closely is, this is the type of beer that blue collar workers will buy, right? Good value. That makes sense to me also. Okay, something that I will expect it to have been also close to this, and it's not maybe as close as I would like, is that that's a beer that I buy on budget, right? So if this will have been closer, I will feel even better about the diagram, but you don't get to